All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Andrew Langer, Director of the Center for Regulatory Freedom and host of the Andrew Langer Show. Welcome to Free the Economy, Andrew.
Hey, it's great to be on, man.
All right, now, so we're going to talk about policymaking and regulation in Washington, D.C. and the swamp effects here.
Yes.
You've been around the world of DC policymaking for a long time, and so you're an excellent person to deconstruct some of the myths that we have here.
Thanks.
So before we go into specific topics, let's just look at the process itself. So the classic narrative about, government and the economy, this is like the high school civics version, is that there are big corporations out there and they're kind of reckless and scary and they're probably doing fraudulent stuff. So we need government agencies to come in. They swoop in and they pass a bunch of rules and they're going to protect us and they're
Right.
going to make the country safe and fair. Um, but in my experience, um, it's been the case that a lot of the laws and regulations that Congress and the executive branch passes are actually just as likely to benefit the wealthy and
Sure.
powerful as they are to protect the rest of us.
100%.
What has your experience been with that dynamic?
Well, right. So, by way of background, I spent 6 years as the regulatory lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Business, which at the time was the nation's largest small business trade association. And when I define small business, I define it as 20 employees or less. It's a very simple definition. And from the purpose or the standpoint of regulations, a very important one because things happen with regulatory costs when a business gets larger than 20 employees. And I knew that when big labor and big business got together with big government and were trying to push big regulation, that something was very, very much amiss. And there are a lot of reasons for it, right? Some of it is competitive advantage. As we know, when a business gets larger than 20 employees, their regulatory costs drop by about 50% per employee per year because of economies of scale and because they're hiring regulatory professionals. There are a whole bunch of things that big businesses can do to make it easier for them to comply with regulations. Some of it has to do with again, competitive advantage, driving their smaller, more agile competitors out of business. Some of it has to do with regulatory normalization, right? If you're a big multinational company and you're doing business in Europe, and we know that the EU has a massive regulatory state and all kinds of mandates that go well beyond what the United States does. Well, you want to harmonize, you want to normalize your regulatory compliance. So you want to get the United States to adopt this EU level of regulation because you can handle it, you're already doing it. And again, because it can drive your smaller employees out of business or smaller competitors out of business.
Yeah, and so the so we've got kind of a couple dynamics here. We've got
Yeah.
the small business, the guy with less than 20 employees versus like the big corporation, but also sort of like US businesses versus this international
Sure.
regulatory harmonized sort of thing. Um, and I feel like the dynamic of competition here works on a number of levels. So competition is generally good. It's generally good for quality, drives quality. That's true in a competitive marketplace between companies, but it's also true, and this is something we've talked about on the show a bunch before about like federalism. So it's true among states. So
Right.
some states have better policies than others. They have lower taxes. They have less regulation. We sort of like California versus Florida, for example, is an
Perfect. Yeah.
example, we like make a lot. Um, and in the within the context of the US, because we have 50 states, and then we've got, my home, Washington, D.C., the special snowflake that's not a state. Uh, they each have they have tax rates, they have levels of regulation, and they're competing all the time for investment and for residents. Often don't like the fact that they have to compete, but they do. And then again, like you were saying, on an international level, we have that same dynamic as well where some countries have lower tax rates and so on and so forth. But what we've seen again in this sort of regulatory harmonization move, when international agreements and global organizations try and get every country to be on the same level and have the same policies, that's the sort of way where they want to policymakers who want to control as much as possible want to insulate themselves from competition
Right.
by saying everyone has to have this level of regulation. And even within the EU, you got a country like Ireland that's very well known for having low taxes, low corporate taxes, and it's attracted huge amounts of uh, of capital. Lots of companies have set up operations there, and it's been very successful. But other countries, even within the world of the EU, especially there, don't really like that because that puts pressure on them, right?
Right.
They're losing out. So you've got things like the global minimum tax, which, I mean, when I first heard about that, I think that really sounded sort of Orwellian.
Oh yeah.
I would prefer a global maximum tax, but um, so we have this we have this dynamic where competition is good and it's good for the little guy, but then we have people who are sort of trying to sort of rig the game by putting these sort of minimum burdens in there. So now it's no longer, so now a company, say like a country like Ireland, for example, can't compete on low taxes because they're supposedly being herded into this, minimum tax type thing. To what extent is that kind of the concept behind regulation, right? Where we can no longer compete but because we have a sort of cartel that's forcing everyone to bear these extra costs.
Well, right. I mean, it's the regulatory version of rent seeking in and of itself. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. One of my favorite examples in this vein is something having to do. It's in the realm of occupational safety and health, and it has to do with what we called in the United States permissible exposure levels, right, to various chemicals, to various substances. And essentially, there was a move during the Obama administration to take European style, and they call it TLV, and I don't remember what TLV stands for in terms of the acronym, but they wanted to take the European exposure levels and simply adopt them by inference here in the United States at home. Without any going through the rigorous scientific process that we go to ensure that regulations make sense. I mean, taking it a step much further back, Richard, in this process, right? You know, obviously, regulations come out of statute, so theoretically, anyway, and we can talk about regulatory dark matter. I know you've spent a lot of time talking about it, but theoretically, right? A legislature determines that there's some kind of a problem, some kind of, and usually with regulations, it's having to do with some version of public safety or health or what have you, and again, sort of getting down to the economic argument of it, the legislature has determined that they want to make it's cheaper to do the wrong thing than it is to do the right thing. So they want to raise the cost of doing the wrong thing so that it's more expensive than the right thing, right? And this gets into, by the way, this myth on the part of the status that regulations don't have any costs, right? Which is certainly coming into fruition now with a lot of new policies. Like they like to say, well, regulations create economic activity. We know that that's not the case. The bottom line is the whole point of regulation is to drive up costs so that it becomes more expensive to do what somebody in a legislature and then in an executive branch determines is the wrong thing as opposed to doing the right thing. So that's sort of the genus, the origin behind the concept of the regulatory state. What happens is obviously that you have a legislature. Legislatures are inherently political, not that executive branches aren't. And so, for a whole host of reasons, legislatures tend to, in legislative language, be very vague in terms of statutes. They want to give the executive branch some measure of flexibility. And so, the more vague and the more flexibility they give to the executive branch, that's really where we get into a whole bunch of mischief with regards to regulations and how the regulatory state continues to expand. And back to now the point of all of this, how it can be used and abused by regulatory rent seekers in terms of ginning a marketplace to their competitive advantage. I'm sorry. Let me add one more thing. And as we've known this, anytime government is able to either transfer vast sums of wealth from the public fisc into some private entity's coffers, or when government can pick winners and losers or create regulatory conditions that pick winners and losers in the marketplace, that's where your age-old corruption happens.
Well, yeah, and this is one of those things that I think people who are sort of, good government advocates and the people who have the sort of, high school civics view of regulation that it's just there to like make our life, safer and more fair, seem to sort of, forget the dynamics here where any one of these regulations on a major industry could shift profits and losses, billions of dollars in one direction or another. And so you're going to have highly interested parties trying to affect that. And those interested parties are going to come up with all sorts of plausible cover stories about why the regulation should go one way or another way. But that doesn't change the fact that their motive is to make sure that as much money ends up in their pocket as possible.
Right. And the other side of it, right, is large, statist nonprofit agencies that rely on government grant monies that turn around and use that money to sue the agencies. The agencies then settle into what's called the negotiated rulemaking. And again, the cycle continues to go, right? This is the fundamental problem here. We could obviously we're dealing with all kinds of issues right now in terms of the regulatory state. And thank goodness we're starting to talk about things like deference, but we need to get at things like negotiated rulemakings, the idea that some entity can sue an agency and the agency will turn around. Let me explain for those of you who don't know. So let's say you have an agency in an anti-regulatory or a slow regulatory administration, an administration that's trying to go after and change the regulatory state. And so from the top, it comes down, we are going to slow down our regulatory growth because we understand the impact the regulations have on the economy. But the bureaucracy wants to pursue a rulemaking. So they turn around and they go to their friends in the statist nonprofit world and say, here's what you're going to do. You're going to sue us. We're going to settle the lawsuit. And in the settlement of the lawsuit, we're going to agree to go into a rulemaking. So our hands are tied, non-regulatory executive branch, new political overlords. We have to do this rulemaking because we've settled to it in court, and the tide rolls on.
Yeah, so when we think about how much of this regulatory stuff and regulatory lobbying is driven by self-interested corporations who
Right.
want policies that are good for them and bad for their competitors and bad for their future competitors, you know, is there a principal difference between sort of offensive and defensive lobbying? So if you're representing a large corporation or a particular industry in Washington, can you stand up for your clients while also basically playing playing a fair game here?
Well, sure. I mean, this is what it always comes down to, right? It's the age old analysis of does a rule serve to, or a policy serve to empower people, or does it serve to disempower people, and does it create disparate impacts in terms of that empowerment or disempowerment, right? So you'll get entities that will lobby for regulatory changes that serve to help everybody, right? Reforms to the toxics release inventory that make it easier for everybody to comply with what's going on with the TRI. But if you have regulations or you have proposals or demands that serve to benefit one sector, in one sector of elites especially, then that's a problem. Or a really good example of this was some of the offshore drilling issues, and over the summertime, the Bureau of Oceanic Energy Management engaged in a rulemaking that was going to up the bond limit, up the bond cost for smaller independent drillers. Now, this could have the impact of driving these independent drillers, and this would create greater consolidation in the marketplace. Not that I wanted to frame it when we were writing our comments as a big oil versus independent drillers issue, but certainly the larger oil companies were starting to turn this into a big versus little. Not that we wanted it to, but that's the kind of a situation we're talking about. Things that have a general impact, as we talk about with the theme of this podcast, freeing the economy, that's a good thing. Things that have disparate impacts, that's a bad thing.
Well, yeah, but I think one aspect of this that uh, kind of gets ignored sometimes is that a heavier burden of regulation in itself has a disparate impact on smaller businesses.
100%.
And so
Absolutely.
so even I think a lot of people could look at a specific rule that said that, well, here's a tax break for, corporation X and a tax increase on corporation Y, and they could say, oh, well, obviously that's not fair, right? Because it's singling out specific people and specific companies. But even rules that are seemingly neutral end up in the long term, in effect, having a negative impact on smaller versus bigger businesses because bigger businesses
Yeah.
always have more ability to deal with them. And that and you mentioned there briefly, I think goes to some of the negative consequences that even people who are generally sort of positive about government regulation can be in favor of, which is that it drives consolidation, right? And
Right.
if you don't want a tiny handful of giant mega corporations owning everything in an industry, then you probably want less regulation,
Well,
less complicated, less expensive regulation.
this is why it's interesting because this is an argument that I've had arguments, probably a disagreement I've had with Veronique de over at Mercatus for many years about this, because there are rules that exist because we as a in the 90s, we as a nation recognized that there were these disparate impacts on small business. Regulations generally have the disparate impact on small business, so a series of laws were passed: the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act generally. And these were laws that were designed to recognize that there is this disparate impact on small business, and that small businesses get an extra bite at the apple, or are nominally supposed to get an extra bite at the apple when engaging in regulatory analyses. The problem, of course, is that, like a lot of these laws and other kinds of executive orders, if you have an agency that doesn't, or not an agency, but an administration that is openly hostile to a deregulatory environment, they're going to go and ignore them at will. And now that we're in an environment in which the administration doesn't care about regulatory costs and have now created policies where we're no longer really interested in examining regulatory costs for any kind of rules, whether or not it's major or minor, it gets compounded. But we as a society have at least on some level recognized just what you're saying, that there are these disparate impacts. And so we're supposed to engage in these greater analyses, and there's supposed to be greater flexibility. Whether or not the agencies take them seriously is a whole nother issue. Real quick, Richard, I don't want to. I want to digress for 1 second here. This is one of those things where, because we're in this great debate over Chevron deference, one of the suggestions that I had long before it ever became a possibility that Chevron deference was going to be overturned by the High Court was to raise the stature of the Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy and the regulatory analyses that they do, so that they get greater weight in terms of this debate between giving an agency deference over an interpretation of statute versus their small business impact. One of the great things, and we could generally say that the bulk of what the Small Business Administration does is garbage, but the regulatory analyses done by the SBA's Office of Advocacy are second to none. They're excellent.
Right. And you of course are familiar with my good friend and colleague Wayne Cruz, who does his report every
100%.
year, 10,000 Commandments.
Oh yeah.
Where he totals up the cost of federal regulation. And, in recent years, it's been about $2 trillion a year.
Yeah.
Long ago, we moved past million and even now billion, and now it's $2 trillion a year.
Actually,
And
Wayne and I are now in agreement that it's now roughly about $3 trillion a year in
oh yeah,
direct
and so
regulatory costs.
and other, like I said, other researchers have put a number even higher than that. And so, so those costs have been rising over the decades, and but without any obvious major crisis, right? Um, a lot of our, economist friends would say, well, it's been slowing down growth and we've had more jobs, we would have had
Right.
more economic growth, but, we're not in a depression right now. We're kind of a decent, we're the workhorse of the American economy has managed to like shoulder that increasingly big burden over the years. But I wonder, at what point do we have a sort of straw that broke the camel's back moment here where the sort of like regulatory sludge and cost uh, does create a burden so high that we face like really significant consequences.
Right. I mean, and I've had conversations with Wayne about this. I just had a conversation with your colleague Ryan Young about that very issue. This issue of the but for, right? But for, this, the $3 trillion regulatory state. It was amazing because Ryan quoted back to me a study that I'm one of the only people who talks about, which is this 2010, 2011 study out of Appalachian State, North Carolina State about opportunity cost. And essentially, what these two professors, Dawson and Cedar, came to is that our economy would be roughly 3 times its size were it not for the massive regulatory state that we have. And so when we talk about the straw that broke the camel's back, one can see it in terms of the debt and the ongoing problem of the national debt. That really, right, let's assume for a moment that we kept, tax rates relatively minimal, but we grew our economic size, right? We talk about this in terms of the push pull, in terms of the supply siders, and when we cut taxes and we have economic growth, and we're always talking, well, it never quite measures up to what the promises are. And I would submit that part of the reason why when we cut taxes we don't see the level of economic growth that we want is because at the same time we are continuing to increase our regulatory state. Now, I'll say this much. Part of the reason why the economy was humming along, not just because of the changes in tax policy, which were nominal, frankly, between 2017 and 2021, but essentially between 2017 and 2021, we saw just about zero growth in the cost of regulation. In 2017, regulatory costs on the aggregate were about $2.25 trillion annually. When Donald Trump left office, they were still about $2.25 trillion annually, which is massive. But still, we didn't have the same kind of growth that we saw during the Obama years, where regulatory costs effectively doubled. And then at the same time, the kinds of regulatory costs that we've had in the first 3 years of the Biden administration. And so as we've come back from the pandemic, part of the reason why we've seen, nominal negligible growth, and the economy sort of trudging along is because there's been this massive addition of regulation. As Wayne says, right, you don't have to teach the grass how to grow, you just have to remove the rocks. And if you keep dumping rocks on your lawn, the grass is never going to grow. So, it's to me, all of these things are very much intertwined. You want to deal with the national debt, and debt service. I mean, then grow the economy massively, hit the accelerator. And actually, and this is, I think, part of what you were getting to. If we continue on the trajectory that we're on, right, where we've added about $750 billion in the last 3 years, so it's about $250 billion a year, we will be at a $7 trillion regulatory state by 2030. On average, sort of growing, and I don't remember the percentage numbers, but essentially, as you put it all on, and $7 trillion in an economy, if we don't grow the economy, essentially having a third of our GDP going to, regulatory costs, direct regulatory costs, that's hugely problematic in the long term.
Well, yeah, and I think it's important to like make the connection to sort of everyday outcomes here. When I think
Right.
when people hear about things like, nominal GDP growth and phrases like that, they think that, oh, well, that's something that economists worry about, or maybe
It's a good point.
CEOs or something worry about. But, I'm just a normal guy with a job. That's not anything to do with me. When we talk about economic growth, that does mean jobs, right?
Right.
That means raises, that means benefits, that means all the good things that any normal person works for, wants to get, is hoping for, right?
Right.
Economic opportunity in America
when
for,
you when you make when you make every aspect of buying a house more expensive, you can't be surprised when houses become more expensive. Right. Sorry, go ahead.
so yeah, just that the things we're talking about aren't just numbers on a graph. They are their jobs, their raises, their houses, their cars, there maybe their second cars, right? They're
Yes.
the things that mean whether or not you can afford to go on vacation or send your kids to college or all of those things. None of those things are going to happen or going to get better for Americans in general unless we have a growing economy.
It's a situation in which, and we can also talk about regulations in terms of time, but if we're talking about it just in terms of monetary costs, and I haven't run the numbers as of late, when last I checked, the regulatory state was costing American small businesses. So again, businesses with 20 employees or less, and that's like 90% of the businesses that are out there, $14,000 per employee per year. So if you're a business with 10 employees, that's $144,000, almost $150,000 that is going to regulatory costs. That means jobs, right? Those are an extra, let's say three people that the business cannot add, or two people that the business cannot add, or capital expenditures to make those employees more productive that they cannot add. It's again. I sort of come back to I love expressing the regulatory costs in terms of time, because time is the only thing that a business owner can't use. And so as I put it, for every 8 hours of burden of mandate that's put on a business, that's a half a percentage point of an employee's productive time. So you might be paying an employee $20 an hour or $25 an hour, but that employee is responsible for generating $100 an hour in revenue for your business. So for every 8 hours, that's $800 of revenue that is not being generated for the business, and that adds up down the road. All of these things, they all conspire to a perfect storm of garbage.
Yeah, and that's, even just looking at sort of the normal domestic sphere. I think that, a lot of people these days, especially a lot of our friends on the right side of the political spectrum, are worried about American jobs, especially like blue collar working class jobs,
Right.
and the idea that, U.S. companies are exporting jobs overseas. But at least some of that has to do with the regulatory burdens that U.S. companies have to deal with
100%.
here, especially in the kind of industries that employ a lot of blue collar workers that are like natural resources and energy intensive and extractive industries that are the ones that are the most difficult to do here in the US. And the, again, the sort of like default assumption among some people seems to be that like regulations in this area, well, they're just there to make sure that like mine workers aren't killed in an avalanche. Well, yes, we want safe working conditions for American workers, but there are plenty of other ones that have nothing to do with direct impact on health and safety, but nevertheless make it much more expensive and difficult to employ exactly those sort of people here in the US. Therefore, it should
Right.
not come as a huge surprise that a lot of those jobs are now done overseas.
Listen, with the Chinese economy, when you have an economy that is essentially based on slave labor, where they don't care about environmental regulations or occupational safety and health regulations, where they can steal ideas because they don't care about intellectual property, it's very easy to have an economy that sort of hums along and benefits the wealthiest Chinese, while exploiting the workers in a horrible way. But at the same time, right, it makes it impossible or very difficult for U.S. industries to compete in the same way. Especially on something like the energy side of it, right? Because these all conspire together. It's an issue of, obviously, there's the wage issue, and on all this debate about minimum wage, and how we sort of had how wages grow organically. There's the regulatory issue. There's the energy cost issue, which again, which nobody's talking about. Not nobody's talking about, which but the left doesn't want to talk about. And so to me, it's like we have to recognize that there is a posture. There are these conditions that create it. Now, I'm not saying that, again, we're never going to get to a point when we don't want a point where we have slave labor. We don't care about environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't care about intellectual property. We care about all of these things. But on the other hand, we can create an environment, right, that is competitive, that recognizes that regulations have costs, and not just direct costs, but all kinds of indirect costs as well. That all of these things conspire together to put hamstrings on the economy.
Right. So before we wrap up here,
Yeah,
it's always want to like end on an optimistic note.
sure.
We're like, oh, what's the solution to all this? So again, our good friend Wayne Cruz, who writes, big expert on regulation. He eats and breathes it.
Oh yeah,
One of the things that he has said that we should do is one, have Congress be forced to approve or disapprove of big, major, expensive new regulations.
100%.
So in multiple Congresses, we've had something called the REINS Act, which would provide for that. But the other one, which is what we had administratively during the Trump administration, which was the sort of a regulatory budget, where it was the two in, one out. So right,
Right.
for every new regulation an agency pushes, they have to like get rid of two other ones. And so, that's one way to do it. Another one is to say that, every given agency that is a rulemaking agency has, so many millions of dollars worth of burden they can, you know, uh, publish rules under, and that once they get to once their rules total up to that much, then they have to stop for the year. So those are both ways, and you could have both at the same time, of controlling costs. But So not only, from my perspective, not only does that say you can't, the federal government can't just pass unlimited costs and burdens on the economy ad infinitum, but the sort of two in, one out budgeting, the idea that you have to get focus on the most bang for your buck, and that over time you sort of refine the rules that are on the books to give you the best possible outcome while not just piling up low value ones over time seems to be like that might be one of the most effective.
I'm
And
a
of course,
big fan.
we sort of didn't have it long enough in place to see the long term
100%.
dynamics of it.
And I'm a big fan of what I call the no net loss of time pledge, which is this idea again, if you express it in terms of hours instead of dollars, right? Whether it's paperwork or actual mandates of things that need to be done. If you add 15 minutes of burden here, you got to take off 15 minutes of burden there. That's a good way of looking at it. But we have to have a national conversation about and these are questions, Richard, that have been going on literally for 30 years. So 30 years ago I worked on a project through something called the National Environmental Policy Institute, essentially a reinventing the EPA project about how clean is clean, right? And so many of these mandates, right? It costs X number of dollars to get this level of clean, and then 10x to go the next 10%, and then 100x to go the next 10%. So the question is, we have to have a conversation as to just what this looks like. And frankly, we have to have a national conversation about not using square pegs in round holes to get what we want, right? We can't use the Clean Air Act to reinvent the energy economy. We can't use the Clean Air Act to reinvent the transportation economy. Things have to actually sort of make sense from a subject matter perspective.
All right. Well, I'm ready to have that conversation.
Amen.
You and I are going to get in a bus. We're going to go around America. We're going to have a national conversation.
I appreciate that, Richard. Thank you.
All right. So Andrew, before we go, where can people find you and all your amazing work online?
So listen, at Andrew_Langer on Twitter, it's where you can find out what I'm doing with the CPAC Foundation Center for Regulatory Freedom. Please go and check me out there. I've got 3 podcasts now. The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire, which is my deep dive into public policy. Have had Wayne on it, just had Ryan on it. We've got Andrew and Jerry Save the World with our former colleague Jerry Rogers. Richard, that's again, that's our conversation. Really, it's about thinking out loud. And we just launched a regulatory podcast called Swamp Secrets: Exposing Regulatory Dark Matter. Go and check that out as well.
All right. Excellent. Thanks for being with us, Andrew.
Thanks, man.